Leadership Forum. It's quite a mouthful. We're going to start with some introductions today. So I'm Christina Fitzgerald. I'm a clinical lead for the IAPT services in Merseycare. And today is co-hosted by myself, co-chaired by myself and Andrew Beck. So I'll pass over to Andrew to introduce himself.
Nice to see you all. See that people are still just coming in from the lobby, so welcome. My name's Andrew Beck. I'm Head of Clinical Health Psychology in Bradford. So I don't work in an IAPT service, but I've been a tutor and a supervisor in IAPT since probably 2 years into the project. So I've never actually worked in an IAPT service, but I've been part of the educational side of things. I also recently been BABCP president and been lucky enough to be involved in the low intensity registration project as part of that. So really nice to see you all today, and good to see some familiar faces popping in on the participants list as well. So good to see so many people have made it today.
Yeah. And yeah, so we're just going to start with a little bit of housekeeping as always. So with technology being as it is, and we've got quite a few of us joining today, we're asking that all cameras excuse me, and microphones are off for the duration of the forum. And because that means we won't be able to see many faces, we're wondering if people would be happy to say their name and where they're from in the chat box, just so we can get a sense of who's here and get a sense of being able to say hello to each other in whatever way we can, technology permitting. So if you've got any comments or questions, please put all of those in the chat, and myself and Andrew will keep an eye on those questions and answer them as best we can as we get to the end of the day or at the end of each session. I hope that's okay with everyone. So all of the slides, hi Neil, nice to see a familiar face. All slides will be available and circulated across the network after the event. So enjoy the day, wait for the slides to come. You don't need to take too many notes unless you want to. Also, this session will be recorded and again circulated across the network after the event. So please contact Polly James or Rhiannon Murray if you don't consent to this recording. So yeah, it's lovely to see so many names popping up in the chat. We've just had Claire, Director of the PWP training in Manchester. Nice to have you here, Kerry. So lots and lots of people. Welcome to everyone. It's really good to have you here.
So before we get on with our first presenters, just want to run through the timetable a little bit. But first of all, I want to thank Claire and Rihanna, who pulled together an absolutely outstanding morning for us. Really appreciate the hard work that went on behind the scenes to get a program like this together. Really looking forward to it. We're going to start with hearing by some of our experts by experience who are making a really significant contribution to the development of IAPT. Then we've got what I think is some really interesting research on who uses IAPT services and some of the profiling of who comes through and makes good use of our services. And that's from Dale Huey after Hilary and Alison's presentation. Then we got a break, and we've got an opportunity to hear from Richard Thwaites and Nicola Walker, who've done some really nice work on self-practice and self-reflection. So this is an opportunity for us to think about kind of the self in therapeutic processes, and both some really practical skills and also some research about how that's been put into practice. Very much looking forward to that. And we'll get a strategic overview from David Clark, who, of course, people will be very familiar with David's work, and Liz Kell, who's been one of the long-standing champions of low-intensity practitioners. Then I'm going to talk very briefly about where we're at in terms of accreditation of PWPs, and then we'll have our closing remarks, and we'll finish by 1 o'clock. But it's a busy morning with just one comfort break to look forward to in about an hour and a quarter's time. So I'd like to introduce our first speakers. We're a few minutes ahead of schedule, but it's an absolute pleasure to have Hilary and Alison with us this morning. And what's particularly great to see is that they're starting the morning for us and reminding us that experts by experience are absolutely at the heart of the way we think about what we do in mental health services, and that their voices are the ones that can help shape what we do for the better. So really looking forward to hearing from Hilary and Alison this morning, and we'll hand over to them.
Thank you, Andrew. So hi everybody, lovely to be with you this morning. My name's Claire Bagley. I'm the Programme Manager for the Northwest PPN, and in this past year we've been working very actively to develop a steering group with the experts by experience that are within the Northwest, in order that we can really better meaningfully involve experts by experience, service user voices into the work that the PPN's doing, but also to influence other parts of the system where we know that experts by experience contribution could really enhance the quality of what we do, and also inform really making care patient centred. We make there's a lot of rhetoric about the patient being centred and being at the centre of care, but actually we've been trying to grapple with, well, what does that really mean in everyday the everyday work of the network. So I'm here today with Alison and Hilary, and I'm just going to do a quick overview of what the network, the steering group, looks like within the Psychological Professions Network in the Northwest. Then we're going to hand over to Alison and Hilary to share their perspectives on the development of the network and the facilitators and barriers. And really the aim of this is to try to we want to stimulate thinking really in yourselves about what does EB involvement look like at the moment within IAPT services, and maybe what it could be. And we'll end with an invitation for you to contact us if you want to be able to think some more about that and maybe share some of the good work that you're doing. Okay, so just a little bit of historical background. The steering group was established last year, October last year, so actually looking at that a year ago. So it's very timely that we're here today, with the aim of building this meaningful involvement. And really our first task was to define what do we mean by meaningful. And I'll talk about a little bit about that in a moment. We, at the moment, in order to think about where do we get the representatives for the group from, and how do we find the people that are best placed to start to inform that discussion, we've worked very closely with the public patient engagement groups within the 3 DCLIN site programmes in the Northwest, so the University of Lancaster, Liverpool and Manchester, where they have a very, very well developed and well supported expert by experience group, one for each university, who also are linked in with national developments as well. So we've got a list of the current members there, and we have a co-chair arrangement. Joe can't be with us today because he's on holiday, but Joe and I are co-chair, so I chair from the HEE PPN perspective, and then Joe is the co-chair as an expert by experience representative, and then we've got Alison, Hilary, Yvonne, Bev and Keith as members, and of course not to forget Polly and Rihanna, who are absolutely essential to the running of the group. Just wanted to make a few important points really, and these are things that we spent a lot of time thinking about in the early days of the steering group, about what do we mean and what's the difference between co-production and consultation. So this is something maybe for you to think about yourselves in relation to the work that you might be doing with experts by experience, is that really we are very much promoting the principle of co-production, which is around equal partnership and working alongside each other. From the beginning, the inception of an idea or a proposal, to the end through to dissemination. And we've found that actually means that requires quite a lot of thought particularly when we're starting to do this sort of root and branch involvement. So that's something to think about. Do you have that degree of involvement? And we'll be asking you a couple of quick questions later on about that. That led us then to think about, well, what are the areas of involvement that really would mean meaningful involvement? So we're proposing that there are 5 areas: education and research, which is probably the area that we're most familiar with involving experts by experience within, but then looking across all of the work that is involved in providing healthcare. We've got service design and delivery, so that will be something that you might well be involving experts by experiencing at the moment. The degree to which is something that we'll ask you about later. But then we've also identified that commissioning of services and workforce development are areas where expert by experience involvement hasn't really been thought about. So they're the kinds of areas that we're also wanting to explore and raise awareness of in the system. So I mentioned that we did some work looking at what do we mean by meaningful involvement, and we co-produced with the group, or the group co-produced these 4 aims that are summarised here. So the steering group is really looking at promoting involvement in training programmes across the 12 professions. So we're asking questions about how that happens across other training programmes other than clinical psychology. To think about improving equality and diversity, and include equality and diversity and inclusion. And that's raised questions for us, very direct questions about the diversity that's represented in current expert by experience groups, including our own steering group. Some very interesting questions that have been raised through doing this work. Thinking about how we involve members of the steering group as critical friends within the PPM work programme, involving people as early as possible and being very clear participants and stakeholders in the work that we do. And then enabling our expert by experience to be able to participate in national and regional strategic forums. So that's really kind of where we've ended up at the end of our first year, and we're starting to develop an active programme of work that is reflecting that, including being here today. So the fact that we're here today opening the IAPT forum is a reflection of that work. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Hilary, who's going to talk a little bit about her experience of setting up a network and give us some pointers about things to think about to make it a success.
Hi everyone, I'm Hilary Tetlow, and I'm from the Lexi Group. I'm chair of the Lexi Group at Liverpool University, and the Lexi Group is Liverpool Experts by Experience. It was formed on the 18th of November 2014, so any minute now it comes up to its 8th year birthday. But in 2018, the BPS gave it an outstanding when it came to re-accreditation for the course. So we've worked very hard in that time. And how we set up the Lexi Group was initially the course team invited all sorts of different external interested parties who had to do with the psychological professions to come and sit in one large room and talk about how they got on when they had psychologists, when they went to see a psychologist and things like that, and what they did and didn't like. And then from that, we did all sorts of things to get them talking together. And then we moved on to having those who wanted to come to a monthly meeting. The monthly meeting was always the same day, always the same time, and it actually did include the ones that we had you met for lunch first of all to have sort of a chat and decide what you wanted to do. And then we split into groups to talk about the course and the different areas. So there was research, there was trying to think of all the other things that we used to talk about. There was teaching, there was getting the team together to get the new people onto the course. So there was all sorts of things to do with assessment of what was sent in by the people who wanted to get onto the course, and we would actually involved in all of that as well. We split into see what then EBEs had to offer with these different areas of the course. And then we developed practical systems and support involving at every stage, having fingers in every pie. We're a bit like a plant. And as we got involved in different areas, so the roots grew and got into everywhere. And now we're really important in the teaching and everything to do with the group. So that's what we did in terms of how we got involved. There's now no area of the course where we're forgotten about. And now I'll hand over to Alison.
Hi everyone, thank you very much Hilary for that. I'm also a member of Liverpool Experts by Experience, and as Hilary said, our root system has really branched out. So anyway, today I'm here as an EBE and public advisor, and really I guess I want to start by being honest that 5 years ago my position was a very different one to the one I hold today. It's that perspective looking back over my shoulder that gives me the confidence to share my experiences with you and my journey from service user to becoming an expert by experience. So sharing that perspective on the facilitators and barriers to EBE engagement, the positives and negatives which can inform you in your work with EBEs. 5 years ago, I didn't leave the house. I had no wish to engage with others and was in the middle of a really difficult to manage mental and physical health crisis. My knowledge of public involvement was scant. I'd seen a few articles and bits and bobs on documentaries, but that was really it. I wasn't an expert then in anything but my own suffering. I had no idea what an EBE was or did, and thought you must have an ology in something to actually be one. It was only when engaging in compassion-focused therapy that a door opened for me. I was able to take my first steps towards life once more, and it was a conversation then about EBEs and what EBEs were that gave me my light bulb moment. Could I really use my experience to benefit services, training and the workforce for better outcomes for other service users? The reply I had back was a resounding yes, and so that's how my journey began, and why being an EBE for me is an integral part of my identity. For all of you working in IAPT, whether you have fully up to speed service user groups or are making the first steps to engage communities and EBEs to support you in training, I guess I just want to say that finding service users to become your EBEs is not a barrier. Even when those service users may know nothing about being an EBE, finding experienced service users, on the other hand, or public advisors, who will enrich your group with their mix of knowledge and skills and experience, is probably easier to achieve because they're already there with established networks. But vitally, you need to embrace and encourage those hard to reach groups to widen participation through diversity by seeking relevant community groups, charities and other services to explain how welcome they will be and how they can enrich your service through engagement and sharing their voice. In establishing contact, it's the simple things that make a big difference. A good poster or advertisement informing service users about what you need and explaining what an EBE is a great start. Put your contact details, tell participants how their input will be remunerated, and that they're valued for their unique perspective. Send that information to the community groups, charities you've identified, and follow up that initial step. Assign a member of your team to be the point of contact to talk to those service users, to allay their fears, discuss their ideas, and how they can contribute. Making these connections and building relationships at the outset really makes such a difference to establishing your EBE network. Involvement as an EBE is transformative, and as mind-boggling as it sounds, from the perspective of seeing myself 5 years ago, I have been given a sense of purpose and a way to reframe the negative experiences that have affected me, and so now to inform, influence and enable change for services and service users for better outcomes is my goal. This aspect of personal transformation and growth through involvement is one of the many benefits that EBEs will find as a result of working with you. Of course, facilitators and barriers, there are so many things to consider. Funding, process to facilitate payment, data security, listening to your EBEs and respecting what they feel able to share. Is your space welcoming? Offering tea and biscuits to welcome anxious EBEs to your premises. Funding for bus or train fares. Plans to help benefits claimants with travel expenses. Is there a clear, transparent payment process? How can you help a homeless person become involved in your service and be paid? The timings of sessions for EBE travel at quieter times of day. And have you provided clear directions, routes and a map, contact numbers and emails for key staff? Are your materials accessible? All these elements really assist in reducing EBE anxiety on the path to involvement. Part of building and growing your EBE network and group can involve upskilling your EBEs by offering planning, training, mentorship and feedback. Certainly when confidence is less at the start, being a newbie, a buddy system can be useful to offer support. The key thing for all EBEs to facilitate meaningful engagement is to ensure co-production is at the heart of everything you set out to do. I know there's a lot to consider here, but EBE groups will grow. Service users are empowered from the point of involvement, and this brings energy and enthusiasm that is infectious and will enhance your work together in IAPT. When the opportunity to participate and share is truly grounded in a relationship of co-production, where everyone's voice is treated as equally valid, rather than the tick box we need an EBE here. Together, you can, IAPT and EBE colleagues with structure and support in place, you can work in partnership to achieve better outcomes for service users, improve service performance with a workforce shaped by EBE inclusion and their lived experience. If there is any support we can give you in IAPT services about EBE involvement, please put something in the chat or reach out to us at PPN Northwest EBE Steering Group, as we would love to hear from you. Thank you. We want to spend the next few minutes or so finding out more about how you are involving EBEs in IAPT. So I'm handing over now to Claire. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. And the aim of this brief session was really to get us thinking about expert by experience involvement, and also to demonstrate the wealth of knowledge and expertise that there is within groups of people that have had experience of using services themselves. And I think Alison and Hilary, just in that short space of time, very ably demonstrate the breadth of expertise and contribution that we can gain by bringing people with lived experience into our services. So having prompted you to maybe think about this so it's early in the day, given you sort of food for thought, we just wanted to just put a couple of quick questions back to you, just to hear from you, really. So we've got 2 questions here, and shortly Polly will just bring up a quick online poll for you to complete. So the 2 questions are, on a scale of 0 to 4, with 0 being not at all. Oh, Polly, you've just, sorry, I was just gone over my slide. So on the scale of 0 to 4, 0 being not at all, 4 being routinely we include these elements all of the time. How much do you agree with the following questions or statements? So EBEs are fully integrated in all aspects of IAPT training programmes, from recruitment through to teaching, assessment and final examination, that beginning, middle and end. And then secondly, EBEs are fully integrated into all aspects of service evaluation and development. So it's how much do you agree with the following statements? So you can see that the poll is coming up in the chat now, and we'd just like you to just give us a quick response. Really, what's your sense? You might not know, but for definite. But we really want to get a sense from what the room's understanding of this was. So we'll just give a few minutes for that poll to start populating. So there's first one coming through around IAPT training. And see interestingly, so what we're seeing in this, Hilary and Alison, is that the poll as it stands at the moment in terms of integrated into IAPT training, it looks like actually of the responses that we've had, 38% have said not at all. 42%, so the largest proportion of are scoring 1, which is a very small amount, and then 15% are 2. And then we do have some responses for 4, but it's only 3%. So it looks like really the consensus in the room seems to be that it's not very well developed in education and training, which is interesting. And then secondly, in relation to service development, we can see a similar pattern really. So 15% are saying not at all, 61% are saying 1. We've got 15% scoring a 2, 3% 1, and 5% scoring 4. So again, very, very highly skewed to the lower end of involvement, if at all. So thank you, that's really interesting, and I hope that as a group, it's seeing those responses is food for thought. I just wondered, Alison or Hilary, did you have any sort of final reflections on hearing the results of those 2 questions?
Certainly, you know, obviously it's really interesting to gauge that response from today's audience, and really just to reiterate what we've said before, is we are there as a resource for you. Please reach out to us if you would like any information from us that we can give you, because truly embedding EBE voice within your training, within your development of your courses, as it is really enriching for you as professionals, as well as for everybody that's going through your training program. So please do reach out to us. We are here for you.
I was going to say, I'm actually not surprised at the outcomes, but I am sorry that it's such a poor showing in terms of how much, because I think we have, as Alison said, a lot to give to all the professions, the psychological professions, and it improves everybody, not just the people working in the profession, but it also improves the EBEs as well. They become much more interested and fulfilled because they can give something back, because we call ourselves the critical friends to whatever we do. That we're there to help, we're not there to hinder.
And I think just one more thing to add is that from the perspective of people going through training, it's that grounding with that lived voice perspective alongside your course that really grounds and really without wishing to kind of overstate that matter, the feedback consistently given to us from all of our EBE contact in training is really gratefully received, and we get very good feedback. So it's just to leave that thought with you too.
Thank you, Alison. So I've just popped up on the slides some links for further information. We have a developing web page, we have a blog, and if you have any questions, the email for the PPN is there, and we would love to hear from you. And Polly's just put a note in the chat box that we'd like to learn about any good practice. So through the course of the day, if there are any examples of good practice around involvement that you know of, please do leave us a note in the chat box, because we'd really like to continue this conversation. And if any of you have a role in involvement within your services and you'd like to know more about what we do and maybe get some support from us, please do get in touch. So thank you very much for the time you've given us, Andrew and Christina, and I'm going to hand back to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Claire. Thanks very, very much, Alison and Hilary, for I found that a really, really helpful, really engaging, really meaningful talk. Words that stood out for me were critical friends. I think that's a lovely description of your role, really, that you're on our side, but you will help us to expand our experience, expand our knowledge, and really make use of yours as well. So yeah, thank you very, very much for that. I really enjoyed it. So next on our list today we have Dale Huey, and Dale is going to talk to us about who uses IAPT services. And this talk comes out of a piece of research that Dale has done, looking in detail at who our service users are. So I'll hand over to you now, Dale, to do that talk for us.
Thanks, Christina. Rihanna, could you put the first slide up, please?
Yeah, of course. Give me 1 second.
Fabulous, thank you. As we're all aware, the case for IAPT was really a drive to address unmet societal need. It's a very strong and persuasive and impactful argument made around effectively common mental health disorders being Britain's greatest social problem. We've collected an awful lot of data over the years in terms of how well the programme's done. There's lots of stuff to celebrate. What we haven't done, I suppose, is looked in detail in terms of the clinical characteristics, really, of people who actually use IAPT services. The argument was made on a very top-down approach to evidence-based practice. So there are these 7+1 disorders, have great impact. Around about 50% of them should be treatable. People should be able to recover. But we haven't actually looked at, well, what does the clinical reality look like, and how well does that map on to the people who use IAPT service previously, and also the question of the people who've always used, or over the last 50 years or so, have used primary care based talk and therapy services. So we thought we'd take a look at that, and I thought we'd share that information. Next slide, please. So we're going to have a look at how we've gone around describing a sample of around about 2,500 people from 4 of our IAPT services, and the details we got came from a caseload survey. So it was everybody who was active in these services at that particular point in time. We're going to go on and do a little bit of a comparison in terms of, well, how does that compare with 2 other services from 2006, a primary care psychology service, which is quite a large one in the northeast of England, very CBT focused, every practice in the borough having some kind of input, either usually from a clinical psychologist or a nurse therapist. and a primary care mental health service, which became a Wave 2 IAPT service, but this data is just before IAPT. And we'll then go on and look at, well, maybe just kind of get a little bit curious whether any of these, yeah, that's great, Rihanna, you're reading me mind there, that's brilliant. So whether any of these variables or more detailed variables that we've collected, how well do they predict who we do well for and perhaps who we do less well for, and more importantly, if there's any learning from us regarding that, both in terms of capability, training needs of staff, and also the interface with the new community model for severe mental health problems. And you'll see on there that it says steps wise, step 2, step 3, 3+. All of our services have an IAPT Plus, for those of you who remember initial commissioning specifications, an IAPT Plus model. So we have an integrated pathway where people will enter within step 2 usually, or step 3, and if their needs can be met by a talk and therapy or the provisions that we have, but they're outside really the remit of a traditional IAPT focus, we will still endeavour to see everybody that we can, but within the step 3+ element of our services. Okay. Next slides, please. So in terms of description, we'll go on and have a look at the one of the questionnaires that went out to all of the staff and the services. Next slide, please. So these are some of the presenting problems, or these are the main presenting problems which were listed. So the idea was that everybody would effectively tick all problems that were present or relevant to the presentation of everybody on their caseload at the time. And you'll see it goes much broader than traditional psychiatric diagnoses, but more kind of clinical presenting problems, some of which are present, some of which are historical. The further analysis that we look at is all on present problems, not problems that people have experienced in the past. There was another category, and I thought I'd just go back and have a look at some of the presenting problems that cropped up in the other category. There were a range of them, things like perfectionism, body dysmorphic disorder, habit disorders, learning disability, ADHD, autistic spectrum conditions, learning disability, suicide attempts present and past and the adjustment from that. So there were a range of other things which were common, but not quite common enough to make the top 15 list, which we'll look at in more detail, and they weren't on the original list of presenting problems or presenting areas. Next slide, please. So if we look at the demographics, there's unfortunately no surprises in terms of the traditional non-equitable provision gender-wise, with around about 1/3 of people using the service who identified as male. Biggest groups in the 20s and 30s and 40s, as is again usually the case, and consistent in any other service evaluation that I've done. Next slide, please. So one of the curious things we asked, if you can remember the initial impetus around 28 days and trying to get access to people to access services before there's any great impact on life trajectory or choices. If you look at the breakdown, and if you look at the line graph to the right, 12% of people in this survey had the primary presenting problem for under a year, 29% 2 to 5 years, 18% 6 to 10, 18% 11 to 20, and around about a quarter had the presenting problem for over 20 years. So Irini very kindly did a comparison with the age of the person doing the survey. So around about 40% of the people using our services had had problems since childhood stroke adolescence, and 60% from adulthood. The bar chart on the left of the screen, it's probably, as you would, it was nice to kind of to see that our allocation to different steps at least seems to be tapping into something chronicity wise, because the darker amber column, sienna, let's call it sienna, the sienna coloured column, we're looking at 44% of the people in step 3+ had had the problems for over 20 years, whereas 6% of the people in step 2 had had the problems for over 20 years. I can't see any questions, but if there are any questions about any of the graphs or the data doesn't make sense, then please flag it up and we'll try and address it either during the talk or immediately afterwards or at the end of the day. I think just to conclude regarding that, there's a lot of people have been living with their life-limiting problems for a long time, would be a fair conclusion. Next slide, please. Okay, we also asked people to make a judgment, and this is just a clinician-based judgment. So at first appointment, we asked people to complete a scale in terms of what they thought the level of motivation for change was for each individual client, and this is how it kind of broke down. So there's a really fairly even spread between low perceived motivation for change, moderate perceived motivation for change, and high perceived motivation for change. There's not a marked difference between the different steps, but you can see a little bit of variation in there. So this is clinician rated. Around about 50% of people accessing the service seem to have, an average level or a moderate level of motivation for change. And we'll come back to that when we look at outcomes and how well that variable did in predicting outcome at final session. Next slide, please. Number of prior services accessed, around about a third of people that had one prior access to service, 15% had 3+, sometimes quite considerable. A whole range, we didn't differentiate. It would be all the usual suspects between prior talking therapy services, private therapy, prior IAPT, community mental health access, inpatient access. We didn't have that recorded for 30% of the cases. Next slide, please. So here are the most common presenting problems. So the most common present presenting problems. 48% pretty much low self-esteem. That was the most commonly reported presenting problem, which won't come as any surprise to anybody who's spent any length of time working in talking therapy services. I think over my 28 years, trainee-wise included, I think that's a very common issue that crops up and is often, very interrelated to recurrent depression or whatever Americans might call double depression. American friends might call double depression. Depressed mood, which is a more kind of mild to moderate level of low mood that's life-limiting, but we've differentiated from more moderate to severe depression, which has more severe functional limitation. Stress-related anxiety, I thought, was an interesting one. When we first developed the categories for this in a primary care psychology department, amongst an experienced group of people who'd spent a long time working in the area, we kind of were saying that we think there's a good group of people who, the people will score high on the GAD-7, but it's not a diagnostic instrument. It's not an observer rated, it's a rating scale for generalized anxiety disorder. So people who with stress-related anxiety would be worried, but they wouldn't have the kind of necessarily the intolerance of uncertainty, sense of overdeveloped responsibility, and obsessional intrusive worry kind of issue that often characterizes people who've had a lifelong relationship with worry and the cursed two words of what if. So there were people who were worried and stressed and had a lot of the symptoms, the tension related to generalized anxiety problems to do with ongoing or recent life events. I just wanted to point out as well, the 21% of people with childhood sexual physical abuse as one of the presenting problems. Really quite high percentage of people with post-traumatic stress disorder, type 1, which would be a one-off adult event, and 11% of people with a type 2 post-traumatic stress disorder or more long-standing childhood events. Next slide, please. Asking the question about comorbidity, what you're looking at here on the y-axis is a count. So you've got a count between the people who had kind of one presenting problem, two presenting problems, and you'll see the most common position was 3 to 4 presenting problems, and then tailing off down to above 10, which is still a reasonable chunk of the population we surveyed. Next slide, please. And if you look at this in terms of presented percentages, 11% of people in this sample had a single presenting problem, 34% was the highest, which was 2 to 3, and around about approaching a third, more than 6 of those presenting areas were relevant to that person's presentation. And again, the line graph shows a breakdown by steps, and again, perhaps unsurprisingly, we've got 48% of people in step 3+ who've got over 6 presenting problems or presenting areas in their current presentation. And I thought it was quite interesting to look at as well. 51% of people in step 2 had 2 to 3 presenting areas or presenting problems. Next slide, please. So we asked the question in terms of the above, which was the primary presenting problem, what was going to be the main focus of intervention, was most aligned to the person's goals or most limiting in terms of their quality of life. Major depression came out on top of that, 16%. Again, surprisingly high when you look at the population prevalence of PTSD. That was particularly in Manchester, there were particularly high levels of that. The rest of it, 10% focus on generalized anxiety disorder, around about 10% on low self-esteem. Stress-related anxiety, again, coming out high. Lower mood, lowered mood or kind of mild to moderate depression for 5%. And you can see the breakdown of the other ones, which were considered to be the primary focus of therapy. Next slide, please. So we decided to group the presenting problems. So if we just looked at anxiety disorders as a primary problem, then you're looking at 38% of people. Depression, so mild and more moderate severe depression, 22%. Then low self-esteem, adjustment-related problems, relationship difficulties, other. There was a cluster of the other problems that we talked about, and then the rest as they break down into different clusters. Next slide, please. So any variation between the different service areas? And actually what I should say before we move on is a really interesting observation, which I think is relevant for training issues and investment, HAE-wise and beyond. 80% of the people in this survey had comorbid anxiety and depression related problems, which probably again isn't any surprise to anybody who's worked in the area for a period of time. But it does have significant implications. We've got lots of choice of therapies that are depression specific, but one of the, I suppose, cardinal rules of delivering efficient and person-centered services is you don't want to be stepping people around, you don't want to be moving people from people who've already developed a good therapeutic relationship with. People fall through the gaps, it's more difficult, we don't want to be telling stories multiple times. So there's a bit of an implication from this data that everybody you sit down in front of really needs to have competencies to work with depression and anxiety related problems. And I think that's worth bearing in mind. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we just look at step 3, and we look at the comparison between 4 services, all in the Northwest and Greater Manchester, you will see that there is quite a bit of observed variation. The people accessing the Manchester service, for example, 50% of people had the problems for over 10 years. And if you look at the line graph on the right, you can see the kind of breakdown there. With some variation, high proportions of people who've had pretty much lifelong problems anyway, a third to over a half. Next slide, please. And again, in terms of primary presenting problem, if we look at that in step 3, no surprises with anxiety disorder, no surprises with depression. Again, the expected levels of primary focus on low self-esteem or a spread of that, but lots of adjustment related problems cropping up as a primary presenting problem. And I suppose quite a bit of variation there in terms of in Trafford, a much greater proportion of people with problems for 1 to 2, or with 1 to 2 presenting problems. Trafford traditionally do much better in terms of recovery as well, in terms of most Northwest services. So I think it's worthwhile perhaps looking through that lens as well. Next slide, please. So if you look at 3+, chronicity, again, just looking at the same 2 variables, you've got perhaps a predictable variation or increased level of chronicity within that step of care, but again some variation between the different services. 41% of people using Trafford service had problems since childhood. 88% of the people using the service in Bolton. Next slide, please. And again, in 3+, there's about 550 people here. Primary presenting problem, if you group it together. No surprises in the other services around anxiety disorders, particularly low in Bolton, but I think there's a greater number of primary presenting problems that are anxiety related being attributed to more trait-based issues and categorized as being more personality related than state-based in terms of a specific disorder. Next slide, please. So if this is the population, or the population as described by these variables using our services in more recently, how does that compare over time with people who were using services, primary care psychology service or primary care mental health service in 2006 and 2008? So next slide, please. So chronicity of problem. The data you've just looked at, the IAPT data, is again in that sienna colour. I don't trust my colour differentiation at all, so apologies if it looks very different to everybody else. The primary care mental health service is in grey, so that's the 2008, just slightly pre-IAPT caseload survey, and then the primary care psychological therapy service is on the left-hand side there. So you can see a similar pattern, really, and I think the thing, probably you can make your own conclusions about what stands out for you, but I think one of the things that stands out for me is that in terms of chronicity, we certainly haven't got any closer to problem onset, it seems, despite a massive increase in numbers of people that have been able to access talk and therapy services. We've still got kind of very large numbers of people who've had long-standing problems. So over 40% using IAPT services over 10 years, and over 20% over 20 years. Okay, next slide, please. So comorbidity, any differences? The primary care mental health service in 2008 had much greater proportion of people with kind of one presenting area, or as rated on that. The colours have changed over here, so the darker kind of sienna colour now is the 2006. The IAPT colour is a more amber colour. But again, looking at comorbidity, we've got approaching kind of the same level of comorbidity that we had in a primary care psychology service. In our IAPT service is over 60% of people with more than 4 presenting areas. Next slide, please. So primary presenting problem, any difference in focus over time? Have the population stayed the same? We've grouped it slightly different here. Again, the IAPT service is in amber on these charts. So we've looked at depression focus and anxiety disorder focus. So if you like, the traditional 7+1 focus that the top-down approach to evidence-based practice has taken. We've got good evidence, a good level of evidence for these 8 presenting problems. We're going to commission and train people to work with these 8 presenting problems, which is one aspect, I guess, of a scientist practitioner approach to mental health care. A concept or a model which is as old as the NHS itself. Both came to life in 1948, the scientist practitioner model in Boulder, Colorado, and the NHS in Davyhulme Park Hospital in Davyhulme, where Morrissey was also born 11 years later, if you want another significant event to happen in Urmston. So the key bit about this for me, I think, is if you look at the non-7+1 focus, so the primary focus that somebody's bringing, even though they're scoring in the clinical range on depression and anxiety measures, you've got a large proportion of people here, and an increased proportion of people, actually slightly, over 40%, who've got a non-7+1 focus to the primary problem they're bringing for us to help with. And that's not too different to how it's been in the past either. So a bit of a messy chart, but again, IAPT recent in amber. So if you look at the problem areas. You can see a little bit of kind of variation. Major depression was much bigger issue for the primary care psychology service. Much closer relationships with GPs, I would say, in those days. I worked in that service for about 6-7 years, and we'd sit on the larger practices, we'd sit in practice meetings. There was a lot of consultation and therapy blueprints for people, and lots of really good co-working around people GPs often had a really good relationship with and had known for a long time, and sometimes known their family for a long time. But again, you can see the range of other issues that crop up and how that's varied over time. Next slide, please. So looking through these different lenses, do any of these clinical characteristics predict recovery? Is there anything we can learn from that? Well, who recovers in those 4 recent services? Just look, and this is, you need to bear in mind, this is just taken, there's no clever analysis of variance or multiple regression here. It's just taking one variable. 62% of people who were employed recovered in these 4 services. People who had one single presenting problem, 62% of people recovered who had one presenting problem. Regardless of the above, if you reached a planned ending with somebody, we talk about treatment completion as attending to appointments involving treatment. It's a kind of pseudo intention to treat model, but really reaching a planned end, really completing treatment, kind of not dipping your toe in the water, but actually completing your 25 meters or your mile sometimes. Nearly 70% of people recover who have a planned ending. Just that simple indication at first appointment, what level of motivation for change does this person have? Have they been referred? Has a talking therapy been prescribed and they've been sent along, or is this something people really want to work on and can be engaged to work on? 65% of people with high motivation for change recovered. Primary presenting problems, 56% of people with an anxiety disorder, no other variables taken into account, recovered. 41% of people who are depressed, 49% of people low self-esteem, 63% of people relationship difficulties, 61% adjustment disorders, 54% childhood trauma. There's often a lot of nihilism about childhood sexual abuse, childhood physical abuse. Actually, it fits really well with the cognitive therapy framework our staff, or most of our staff, are very competent and able to deliver. 33% who had a personality disorder diagnosis, and I'll come back to that in a minute in a bit more detail, recovered on the measures of distress. Okay. I should say this is a smaller amount of population. This is a subpopulation of the caseload survey that we followed up on the clinical information system at a later date. Okay, next slide, please. So the SAPAS is a brief 8-item scale meant to tap into trait-based difficulties compatible with a diagnosis of personality disorder. There's two major kind of validation or psychometric studies published, both with very small samples, around about 60 people from memory. But basically, you can score 1 to 8. This issue is either present or it isn't. It isn't meant to be state-dependent, trait-dependent. Either like this or not. A score of 3 is about 90% predictive of a personality disorder, although I think that's probably, it would be more robust to use a score of 5, but I'll come to that in a minute. So this is 2,500 discharges from our Trafford service, where we collected SAPAS as one of the initial measures as they entered the service. So you can see the kind of spread there, not many people scoring 0, about just below 3%, and then people who scored 1, 18.5% scoring 3, and 17%, 18% scoring 5, 12% 6, 7% 7, 2% 8. Does that make any difference in terms of predicting outcome? Next slide, please. So you're looking at 2 lines there. You've got the same scores of between 0 and 8 along the bottom, and then on the y-axis you've got both the recovery rates and the reliable improvement rates. And what I really wanted to point out here is 2 things. The lighter blue line is recovery, So recovery, again, taking into account no other variables other than just initial SAPAS score. The recovery for people on 0 and 1 and 2 is extremely high. It's above 60%. It's still 50% or above when you get to 3, and then it starts to really fall off a cliff once you get beyond 4 and 5. Recovery dipping down to you know, the 30s, 20s%, at 6, 7, 8 score on the SAPAS. Reliable improvement, perhaps again, as you might expect clinically. If people have got a lot of trait-based difficulties that effectively get in the way not only of short-term token therapies, but of life, you know, that make life more difficult. It shouldn't really stop us helping people feel less distressed. It's going to make it more difficult for people to have a really mean and clinically significant change. Okay, so bear that in mind, kind of softer tail off in terms of reliable improvement and a more distinct difference in terms of recovery. Next slide, please. Okay, so who has higher chances of recovery? Well, reiterating, you know, 7 out of 10 with high motivation, 6 out of 10 receiving low intensity treatment alone recover, which is perhaps validation that we're getting the right people into our step 2 services. I should have said as well, we only deliver step 2 in 2 of the services that we looked at. 7 out of 10 with a planned ending, 6 out of 10 people with an adjustment or anxiety related problems, primary problem, achieve recovery. Next problem, please. Next slide. Who do we do less well for? Taking into account nothing else, 7 out of 10 people who are unemployed are still in caseness when discharged. Only 3 out of 10 people with low motivation achieve recovery. 8 out of 10 people with an unplanned discharge don't achieve recovery, perhaps unsurprisingly. 6 out of 10 people with more than 6 presenting problems fail to recover. And 7 out of 10 people with a personality disorder as primary problem, diagnosis or category don't achieve recovery. Okay, next one, please. And that was it in terms of the slides I wanted to present. Apologise, there was a lot of information in there and a lot of data to digest. And you can see there are things in the chat. Is there any questions that people have? Do we have time for questions, Christina?
We do, Dale. We've got until 10:45 this morning. So we'll do, yeah. So we've got some time for questions for sure. And there were a couple of questions that have come up in the chat, Dale. Let me have a look at those for you. So the first one that has come in has come from Nicola Walker, and Nicola is wondering about the difference between patients who were referred versus those who were self-referred into IAPT. Perhaps GPs were making a judgment. Yeah, I think it would be true to say, Nicola, that there were definitely more, not as many as we would like, and I would like to think not as many as if we did the survey again, which I intend to now. But there were still self-referrals in primary care psychology. We actively encouraged people to develop if you like, a known relationship with a particular practitioner. And because we had particular practitioners linked to practices, that worked very well. A guy called Bernard Catt told me at the beginning of my career that working in primary care psychology, there are basically, and apologies Bernard if you're here or anybody knows him if I misquote you, but there are basically 3 groups of people who use services. There are people who, with the right kind of access to the right kind of intervention, will have a one-off contact with service, you know, and that's about 1/3 of the people that he'd seen over his career. Around about 1/3 of people, because of the nature of the presenting problems they're coming along with, and because of the nature of the personal resources, social resources, their traits, if you like, are likely to have episodic or intermittent contact with services. And around about 1/3 of people are likely to have chronic or persistent problems and will have regular contact with services. The aim's always to move people down that continuum, you know, the intermittent to the one-off and the persistent to the episodic. You always aim to do that. But the introduction of self-referral within that primary care psychology services some time ago was trying to just accept that
position. You know, that there are this third of people who appropriately use talk and therapy services. And I was there long enough to see some very complicated people coming through that I don't think is necessarily changed that much in terms of the IAPT picture. So people who wouldn't be able to access, say, the local psychotherapy service, a local borderline team because of their risk behaviour, still get primary care service, still are accessible to primary care psychology. At the time, there's lots of resettlement from long stay inpatient hospitals, you know, so people reintroducing to, you know, kind of a different lived experience. Big groups of people who would appropriately reuse service, and sometimes a longer intervention with a good formulation. You know, people would come back, they would either hopefully meet the same person or meet somebody else who had access to that. The GPs and other primary care health professionals would be queued into that. So that self-referral element was there, and I think worked very well. I can certainly think, maybe it's selective attention, but I can certainly think of a couple of people even now who used that service where, you know, they had a long intervention, a shorter intervention, and actually one or two just kind of top-up interventions where it was a case of, is this something new? Is this something coming back? Have we lapsed into, you know, old ways of coping? So, you know, self-referral did happen then, but maybe a bit more now, but yeah.
Thanks, Dave. So another question here in the chat from Kieran around autistic spectrum disorders.
Yeah. Yeah, not in terms of, I suppose, primary problem. It was there. There was no confirmation of that really. I think it was, usually speaking, I think in the IAPT sample anyway, it would be people who kind of would come through with that or with a query that anyway. But we didn't. It wasn't just about confirmed only.
Okay, and we have here Kelly.
Hi, Kelly.
So Kelly's asking about, I was going to ask which step 2 services were included.
Don't worry, Kelly, we haven't nicked your data. No 6 degrees in there. Yeah, it was just the Bolton step 2 provision and the Trafford step 2 provision were included in that caseload survey. You're very welcome to join in the next.
Hi, thanks, Dale. I suppose it's not just about nicking the data. I was thinking about the implications for the research and the biases potentially. So, I mean, I'll have a read of the paper. I think it's really interesting, but I suppose it's drawing conclusions from that data when there's small amounts of step 2 services in there, isn't there? That can have huge data. And I suppose the other thing was about diversity in Mant. I think that, I'll have a read of it and have a look, but I think just from the presentation, something about male and female, isn't there? I'd be interested to see who's included in the research. So I'll have a read. Really interesting. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks, Kelly.
And I think here in the chat as well, we have a follow-up question from Nicola Walker. Yeah, what are the implications of your audit?
It's a big question, isn't it, really? And I think one of the issues we struggle with is we would all want to be delivering, you know, best possible care, you know, kind of not what an individual practitioner particularly likes to deliver or, you know, kind of speaks to them, or but what the person sitting in front of that practitioner needs. And I think if you look at organisations like National Voices and you look at the concept of treatment choice from a user perspective shouldn't be about, you can have this brand name you know very little about, or this brand name you know very little about. It should be a true collaborative consultation program, really understanding what somebody's presenting with, also really understanding what their actual outcome goals are. You know, what their, it's a silent misdiagnosis was an important paper. You know, what's the treatment outcome that the person wants? Somebody might have OCD, somebody might have a social anxiety disorder. If the treatment outcome they want is more to do with bereavement or loss related issues, that's a treatment outcome where we should be steering people towards, I think. You know, and there's some caveats to that when people have got a lot of comorbidity and you think the person helping them towards their preferred outcome needs to understand that phenomenology of the comorbidity that somebody's presenting with. But in terms of implications for me, it's about really we want science, not scientism, You know, we don't want lenses to look at what we do that are too narrow, that really don't describe. We have to evaluate outcome, but we need that to do that in a nuanced way. And we also kind of, if you think about the training issues and implications, I've been involved in cognitive therapy training for, well, I suppose since I was newly qualified, so since the late 90s. The sign over my right shoulder I can see was stolen, please don't tell on me, from Collinwood Clinic in Newcastle before it was demolished, which was a major cognitive therapy training centre. We didn't train people in a very disorder specific way there. You know, we train people in a way to understand the conceptualizations of disorder, the models, you know, kind of the phenomenology that maintain problems. But we didn't give people silos to drop, or at least I hope we didn't. I'm not suggesting that all IAPT training courses do that, but what I have observed over the time is that there are a lot of people who qualify who've been sold the idea that the world exists out there in 8 kind of superhighways and somebody falls into one of them. They don't. And you need to be able to understand the person's perspective to really help them understand it and to formulate it appropriately. The person who would probably still tell me off if she knew I stole that sign was a woman called Ivy Blackburn, who I worked with there. Ivy's position was, even though, you know, she was very protocol specific and research focused, when you've seen one person with depression, you've seen one person with depression. You know, there might be consistent themes, there might be consistent maintenance factors for any of those presenting problems. It doesn't give you special particular insight into that person's experience. It gives you some tools to help them make sense of their experience. So I'm not drifting too far off the question, but I think some of the implications are training issues and CPD issues. We need people to demonstrate competency, if you like, in mirror signal maneuver, cognitive behavioral therapy, or any other treatment modality. We need people who can work from first principles as well. There's a lot of comorbidity out there. There are a lot of people who do very well with talking therapies who perhaps won't reach recovery, but will significantly improve their quality of life and learn over the course of their relationship with services. You know, I think it was Marvin Goldfried. I used to attribute it to Tim Beck, but I think it was Marvin Goldfried in 1977 who said cognitive therapy is basically training people to act as their own therapists. That's what we do. You know, we talk about facilitated self-management or facilitated, you know, other kind of approaches. But what basically, we're helping people understand their experience and how to deal with it in future. So I think to do that, we need to be focusing that on the phenomenology that actually people are going to see. It's a very isolating role, potentially very autonomous, despite, you know, protestations sometimes of staff are feeling controlled externally by KPIs. You're making decisions that, in the absence of evidence, a lot of the time, it's a really difficult position, and we need to acknowledge the complexity, the chronicity, the comorbidity of people who are coming through and have done over the last however many years and used our services, and prepare staff to do that. And I think I'm not saying that we don't do that, but I do think that's a really important focus.
I suppose I was particularly thinking about that cohort with personality disorders, and whether you think there should be a pathway, maybe a longer pathway for those people so they can move closer to recovery. But it seemed to suggest that, your data.
There's a whole can of worms there. What I will say on behalf of myself, other than nothing else, I've always worked with complexity, even from being newly qualified. And if you look at, you know, probably the best outcome data ever for personality disorders, which is the schema-focused therapy trial in 2006, really well designed. If you speak to rather than reading the glossy brochure and the implications for schema-focused therapy, if you speak to the people involved in that, a lot of that treatment modality in the cognitive therapy arm was actually giving people access to evidence-based approaches for their social anxiety disorder or for their deliberate self-harm or their panic-related problem, as well as having a broader conceptual framework to understand the developments of beliefs or more mode-related thinking. I would always vote for that. You know, people are people. Sometimes people are more prickly. Some people have some more difficult beliefs than others. Not everybody's as easy to work with. But if somebody's got a life-limiting anxiety problem, for example, I think that needs to be the primary focus of help, because life and everything is just more difficult if you're terrified all the time. So I've always been a fan of and I've always kind of tried to make sure that we see as many people as we have and the services are being responsible with who would attract that diagnosis. Where we fall down are the people who would fall into a kind of cluster A type presentation, or where you think the primary mode of intervention is actually interpersonal, or on, you know, it is more of a relationship focused intervention that's required perhaps over a longer time. So I think, you know, we can interface better with the community pathways for severe mental health problems, but we should always be the first stop for people who are presenting with an anxiety related problem and or depression a lot of the time.
Dale, thank
Great,
you.
thanks.
Thank you enormously for your presentation. I can imagine there are, you know, myself among them, but many people here have really enjoyed it and taken, you know, kind of real validation, you know, from the population that we're seeing in terms of comorbidity, chronicity, and that need for you know, to help our clinicians to facilitate that really rich clinical decision-making environment where, you know, it gives people, like you say, the autonomy to use their skills and their knowledge to treat the person in front of them, you know, and for that to look like what it needs to look like. I'm just aware of our time there. We've come to our comfort break.